Thank you very much, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As just been introduced, I'm going to talk to you this afternoon about resilient positioning, navigation and timing, or PNT for short. And I'll explain really what it is, why we believe it's important, and show you what life is like if you don't have it. I'll then pass the floor over to my colleagues who will tell you what ACCSEAS has been doing to realise resilient PNT as part of the multi-source positioning service. So for those of you unfamiliar with the idea of resilient PNT, you may well ask, well, why do we need it? And we've heard various things this morning about the use of GPS and what we're doing with it, but we have to bear in mind that GPS has become the normal means of obtaining a vessel's position, of understanding where it is and what it's doing, and it's understandably so because it's freely available and it works remarkably well for most of the time. And the cheap nature of the receivers means that if you need more positioning information, you put another receiver on the bridge or on the top of the vessel, and the way in which that data can be interfaced and spread around the vessel means that you find GPS data in all sorts of places now, and I've given you an example on the slide here. And it's in places you'd expect, things like the electronic chart display and information system, so where you can see where you are, but it's in places you may not expect, things like the ship's clocks. So that GPS data from the receiver on the bridge is now being disseminated across the whole vessel, to the likes of the engine room or to the cabins or to other parts. And where's that data being used and what is it being used for? And importantly, what happens if it's no longer there? They're the sort of questions we need to consider and understand so that we can keep our operations, actually continue operations if we lose that information for whatever reason. But we need to consider that GPS, while it's the means, the system that's being used for the majority of vessels now, isn't the only global navigation satellite system, or GNSS, that is available or being developed. And this slide gives you a sort of overview of the different systems out there, and it's a little bit busy, so to explain what it's doing. In the figure, we've got, in each row, we've got the different satellite constellations. So if we start, we've got GPS, then we've got GLONASS, the Russian equivalent, Galileo for Europe, Compass or Beidou for China, and so on. And then in each column, we've got the frequencies of which they'll be using, the signals that they'll be sending out, which frequencies they'll be on. And you can see that actually they line up quite nicely in nice columns. That's a deliberate ploy. There's a lot of benefit to be gained by a receiver being able to use all the different satellites that are out there. It does very much for in terms of the availability and the way you can use the different constellations. But what it does mean is if you get any problems, and particularly on this right-hand side, which is where all the civilian signals are, if you get any problems on here, any interference, you can effectively take them all out in one go. So it gives a single point of failure in that sense, and that's what we need to get across. We need to understand what that means and find a way of getting around that. So what can cause that sort of interference? Well, it can be a whole host of different things. It could be anything from a system failure. It could be anything down to hardware failure on the vessel. You've seen that. It can be natural events like space weather, or it can be intentional events where someone's actually gone out and purposely tried to deny that service for you. And I'm going to cover a few of those in a little bit more detail. We'll start by saying that these things do happen. They're quite rare, but if we consider April last year, the Russian GLONASS system went off air for over 10 hours. That was caused because an engineer uploaded the wrong data. One way of making yourself popular at Christmas time is to take your system off air for 12 hours. But we're human, we all make mistakes. But that happened with no warning, with no notification that it was coming. It took the system off air, but it only did that after it allowed the error to grow. And we saw position errors. This is our GLONASS receiver at the office in Harwich. These are the reported positions up to sort of 50, 60 kilometres away. And there's reports of sort of 200 kilometre errors. But it's that whole thing of how do you know it's happening? What do you do about it? If that had been GPS, we would have had a lot more news stories and a lot more implications. Coming back to things like the actual interference side of things, natural events, space weather. The sun is kicking out a lot of emissions, a lot of charged particles as part of solar flares. It's happening all the time. In September last year, there were two particular solar flares happened on the 9th and 10th of September, pushed charged particles towards the Earth and resulted in what's known as a geomagnetic storm. Basically, it's the charged particles interacting with the Earth's atmosphere, what gives us the aurora and the poles, things like that. But it affects the GPS signals as they come through the atmosphere. And we saw two events, the implications from the single event, two different locations. If we're looking on the east coast of the UK, over by the Harwich approach, and then on the east coast of Ireland, coming into Dublin. These are the vessel tracks for two different vessels at the same time in the morning. They're colour-coded by the time, and we can actually see we have holes in their reported position. That's where their vessel's AIS could no longer give its updated position because it's being affected by space weather. So these events happen. And then we can consider one of the more sort of fearsome events, in the sense, is intentional interference. And we say intentional in the sense that someone's gone out of their way to cause that problem. They may not know the extent of the problem that they're causing. If we consider one of these jamming units, you can go and buy them. They're illegal to use in all countries, I think. If you go and buy one of these, it's saying it will jam for 4 to 6 meters. They generally will actually jam GPS for a much larger area than they're saying. This is the sort of thing we understand people that are using, sort of the white van man who doesn't want to know where his boss is taking the van at lunchtime, is actually using in their van. And there's a case of a van driver in America who was driving past Newark Airport and took the system there down. He was actually identified and prosecuted, fined a significant amount of money, and lost his job. But he was only jamming on the belief that he was only affecting his own vehicle, not actually affecting everybody else around him and the wider community. And then we go across to something like this jammer we found on the internet. Reckons it will jam up to a kilometre. Something like that on the headland isn't something we really envisage or like to see happening. But as we get into an environment where we have more reliance on GPS for things like toll charging or those boxes that go in your car and tell the insurance company how well you can drive, the appetite for having something in your car to stop that is going to grow. And what happens if you're on an open top ferry and someone has one of these in their car and drives on your boat? What does it do to you? And that's really where we're coming from. And it's understanding the issue and then actually being able to do something about it. And ACCSEAS conducted a jamming trial in 2013 under control conditions, and this lets you see for yourself what happens.
Jamming signal. And it's going to slowly increase the nearer we get to it. And we start getting these alarms go off. As the jamming signal builds up, we'll get more alarms. So we're heading towards this, but it's night time. You're on the bridge by yourself, a couple of alarms that you're kind of normally used to and you can go and deal with. When we start getting a host of alarms going off, what do? We can see, if we come over to some of the units over here, we can see some of the effects starting to happen. And we've got all the alarms, we can see that our differential GPS receiver has now lost all the satellites. Our AIS unit is also complaining. We've then got these units alarming out. So the compass and the gyro compass use GPS to help collect for any errors, any latitude drift errors. They've now gone into alarm state. Our depth sounder doesn't know where we are in terms of trying to correlate the depth to the chart position. The radar itself is showing that error of nav speed on the right, and we're still at relatively low data levels. We've still got some systems operating. Our electronic chart in the centre there still has green numbers on it. As that jamming signal increases, as we get nearer still to that jammer, we'll see that turn red. We're now trying to work out why are all these alarms going off. What do I do about it? Have I got a system failure? Has an antenna fallen off? Someone actually trying to cause me problems? We can see on our electronic chart, we've got various alarm sounds going off. We've got alarms telling us that our position is unsafe. Our error is growing. The position solution is getting worse because that signal is increasing to the point that receiver is now struggling to know where we are and calculate its position. But the implication is that you lose a lot of information about where you are and a lot of the situational awareness information of what's around you. Things like the radar, even though the actual function of the radar itself hasn't changed, it's now entered an alarm state because it uses GPS for an additional function. So how do you know that you can still rely on it? Well, you have to go back and understand what that error means, how you can disable that error, and know what you can do to make it usable again. And that takes knowledge, understanding, and practice.
So that gives you just a quick understanding what it'd be like to be on the bridge, all the different alarms and all the pieces of equipment that have entered an alarm state or stopped working. Now let's imagine it's night time, you're the third officer. What do you do first? Do you wake somebody up? Do you try and cancel all the alarms, some of which you may not be familiar with or know how to cancel? All the while you're being distracted from actually doing your job of navigating the vessel. So ultimately, in terms of resilient PNT, what we want is something that will allow us to identify when our GNSS is being disrupted or shouldn't be relied upon. Something that's going to tell us, something that's going to mitigate the effect of losing it and allow us to carry on with our actual day job, with our operations of doing the task at hand. And at that point, I would like to pass the floor over to my colleagues who will tell you what the project's been doing to give us resilient PNT. Thank you.